Hello and welcome to the Kearney Math Show. Thank you all for tuning in to today's episode. On today's episode in the Kearney Math Show, we are going to be featuring squares and square roots. So many of you took a pre-test just for us to see kind of what you know. And I found that this was kind of a unit that maybe we didn't have a lot of prior knowledge about. And that's okay, because by the end of today, you're going to say, oh my gosh, Ms. Kearney, that was so easy. When you think of squares and square roots, it really is what it sounds like. It has a lot to do with a square. So before we get started, what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and at the top of your mini lesson, because you've already updated your table of contents, go ahead and write entry number 1 and read that learning goal to yourself. So entry number 1. And our learning goal is that if someone's not here today, I want you to be able to explain to them what is a perfect square and maybe even be able to tell them the first 15 perfect squares. Okay? So here's our wonder. Here's our big question. How can you find the side length of a square when you are given the area of the square? So you've already completed a quick investigation where you were given the area, and let's say the area of that square was 36. Okay, so we're trying to find what would the side lengths be. And many of you already saw that. You're like, oh, well, that's easy. I know it's a square, so I know the sides have to be equal. To find the area, it's length times width. So my length and my width have to be the same. So many of you are thinking, well, what number can I multiply by itself to get 36? And it would be 6. Okay, so that's exactly kind of what a square, a perfect square, and the square root is all dealing around. It's all dealing around the idea of that area of the square. So let's look at the keyword perfect square. So what is a perfect square? A perfect square has 2 identical factors. Okay, that means I can multiply a number by itself and get that number. So for example, 25 is a perfect square because the factors, we can multiply 5 by itself, 5, or 5 squared, and you're going to get 25. But when you heard Miss Kearney say 2 identical factors, what you have to think of is you can also, 25 can also be broken down into -5 and -5, because -5 times -5 gives me an area or a product of 25, okay? So since 25 is a perfect square, if we wanted to take the square root of it, we're simply thinking of the 2 numbers that you would multiply by itself to get 25. So since it can be 5 or -5, what we're going to do is we're going to write it just like this, plus or minus 5. Okay, that means that 25 is a perfect square. And then we kind of already touched on this. What is a square root? Well, 25 was the perfect square, and when you were trying to figure out what number you can multiply by itself, that number was the square root. So the square root of a number is a value that can be multiplied by itself to give the original number. Okay, so let's think of another perfect square. What's another perfect square that you can multiply a number by itself to get it? So for me, I would just think of 64. 64 is a perfect square. So if I wanted to find the square root, and many of you didn't recognize that symbol. That symbol yesterday on your pretest, that was just saying, what's the square root of this number? So the square root of 64 would be, well, what number can I multiply by itself to give me 64? So the square root of 64 would be plus or minus 8. Because 8 times 8 is 64, and -8 times -8 is 64. Okay? So that's pretty much the new stuff for today, guys. Perfect square has 2 identical factors. And then if you wanted to find the square root of that perfect square, it would be the number that you can multiply by itself to give you that number. Okay, so right now I'm going to get you started on the practice, and then you guys can finish it up. So the square root of 16, so the square roots of 16 are, so You could do 4 times 4 to give you 16, or you could do -4 times -4. Because 4 squared and -4 squared could equal 16. Okay? So square root of 81, if my area of my square was 81, that's a perfect square. What number can I multiply by itself to give me 81? And you can either do 9 or -9. And just to remind you, you can do plus or minus 9. Okay? So you're going to keep filling those up. I do want to point, you're going to continue doing that practice and you can check the answer key. But I do want to point your attention to something that's a little bit after that practice, okay? So if you'll kind of look over on the right-hand side, many of you have seen this button on your calculator. It is, if you're wanting to find it, it is the blue little button that's above the x squared, okay? So if you see x squared, above it, it has a little blue button that has that symbol, okay? And if you use that button on the calculator, it is only going to give you the positive square root, okay? And that's because that's called the principal square root of a number, okay? The principal square root is only the positive. So, for example, if you put in your calculator with a square root of 4 or 16, you're only going to get 4. Now, if you decided to do, that's the principal square root. If you decided to take it a step further and say, well, what's the negative square root of 16? That means you're taking the square root of 16 first, which is 4, and so that would be 4, but then the negative of that would be -4, okay? That's not saying that -4 times -4 gives you -16. It still gives you 16 because 16 is a perfect square, okay? So there's some interesting things to think about as far as positives and negatives. So like, for example, something to think about, could you ever have a negative perfect square? Okay, that's something I want you to think about, and you're going to come to me later and you're going to share your answer. So can you ever have a negative perfect square? Why or why not? And be able to explain your reasoning. Okay, so right now what I want you to do is I want you to go through and finish those 1 through 15 practice. You can check the answer key. And then you got a few more simplify expressions. So let's look at one of those simplify expressions. So like number 1, it says the square root of 49 plus 10. You're going to still do the square root of 49 first, so which is 7, plus 10, which is 17. Okay? And then here it's going to talk about some companies or some professions that you might see square roots in. So take a look at those and try to think if you can think of anywhere else. I think it's really interesting that law enforcement and how they use square roots. So take a look at that and be able to explain that to me when you come to me. And finish the practice, and you can check the answer key. And when you come to me, I want you to come with that challenge question. Can you ever have a negative perfect square? So think about that and continue on with the practice. All right, guys, make me proud. Stand up, hand up. Excellence as always. Peace out, Rainbow Trout. Love you, mean it.